There's a couple little blessings that pastors get to enjoy rarely. One is being with their congregation and not preaching. That's a strange blessing. Today I am a recipient of that blessing, but the bigger blessing is that I get to listen to one of the pastors that this church was blessed to have for years and years, Dr. Goddard. And I've never been able to hear him preach before. This today is a special blessing for me. So Dr. Goddard, we are grateful that you're here. We thank God that you've been able to come back and visit with us, even for just one Sunday. So please come now, share with us God's word, and we delight. We thank God that you're here today. Thank you.
I'll tell you who really missed being here today. It's my wife, Beverly. Beverly and I would have celebrated 60 years this last Friday, but she died in February. Strangely enough, quite unexpectedly. She went into the hospital with some pain in her stomach, was diagnosed with stomach cancer in the lining of her stomach, and never got out of the hospital. She was in Holy Cross Hospital in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. We had just come back from a cruise and were having a great time when she suddenly wasn't feeling well. The nurse came in from hospice and said, "Mrs. Goddard, the doctors are recommending that you go into hospice. You know what that means?" She said, "Yes, that means that's where I'll go to die." And so the nurse said, "Are you upset by that? Does that bother you?" She said, "No. I know who I am. I know to whom I belong, and I know where I'm going." And then she turned to me and she said, "Now at my service, don't use that poem with the ambiguous ending." I knew exactly what she was talking about. But it was in 1989 that we came to Southside. Now, some of you may remember Al Muro, the founding pastor of this church. It was founded by a group of, shall we say, renegades, disaffected pioneers from First Baptist Church downtown. As I understand, they met in the home of Etta and Ernie Ford over on Hope Street, and then formed the Southside Community Church as an offshoot of First Baptist downtown. How many of you were charter members of that church? Let me see your hands. Quite a few. And then after Al resigned and moved with his wife downstate a little bit, William Christians became the interim pastor. And then Vern Thompson became the interim pastor. And then finally they called me in 1989 to be interim pastor. And the executive minister said, of course, they couldn't call you to be pastor of the church because you're an interim. So I left and went down to Laguna Niguel, where one day two people showed up. Is it Dale and Barbara Poloni, as I remember, and said, "We want you back at Southside." And the two of them and Al Muro, Al's son Mark, conspired together, and I was called back to be pastor of the church. That was in 1989. In 1999, I retired. So it's been 15 years since I've been here, and I've put on 15 pounds and lost 15 pounds of hair. Now it's very simple to get dressed. I just comb my hair with a wet wash rag. But as I was thinking about what I would share with you today, I'm sure that most of you have heard what I'm going to say. Many of you have. And if you haven't, well, then you'll hear it today for the first time. Several years ago, a Swiss theologian by the name of Roald Howell wrote a book. And this is one of the phrases I remember from that book. He said, God created two orders. He created persons and he created things. He created persons to be loved and things to be used. And our sin is that we reverse the order and we love things and use people. And he went on to say that's the power of the personal that makes a difference in someone's life. I've learned this. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Isn't that true? You can have all the knowledge But unless you care, and I'm going to interrupt myself occasionally because I'll remember different things. We all say that the primary principle of Christianity is love. And that great love chapter in 1 Corinthians says it all. If I speak in the tongues of men and angels and have not love, I'm a noisy gong and a clanging cymbal. The next time you read that, just change the word love to care. If I do all those things and I don't care, because the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is not caring. Think about it. The opposite of love is not hate, but not caring. I've had several Bible study groups over the years, and there was one group, this woman asked if she could ask me a personal question. You always have to be careful when someone says, may I ask you a personal question? She says, Pastor, who other than Jesus is your favorite Bible character? And I thought, I don't like the term character. I'd rather have personality. But then I got to thinking about it. What is personality but a set of characteristics? We're all characters of one kind or another. So who is your favorite Bible character? I thought that was a pretty good word. I'm glad I didn't answer her right away, because I would have given some smart answer like, the shortest man in the Bible. You know who the shortest man in the Bible is, don't you? Dale? Nehemiah. Okay. But I got to thinking about who is my favorite Bible personality? Who has impacted me? Whose life would I like to emulate? And I got to thinking about it. So I'm going to give you the results of my ruminations about the favorite Bible characters. I had to start with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but that's the beginning. Abraham was the first Hebrew. He was the one who was called by God to leave his homeland and become a pilgrim, the father of the faithful. He was to go where he did not know. Many of us do that too, don't we? We go where we don't know. We just be obedient. Take the first step. Head out the door. Be obedient. Abraham was. Abraham and his wife Sarah had a child of the promise. By the way, his name was Isaac. You know what the name Isaac means? She laughs because Sarah, when she heard that she was going to have a child at her advanced age, laughed. And so he was named Isaac. Now, Isaac is distinguished by two things. He was, of all the patriarchs, he was monogamous. He only had one wife. That's unusual in the Old Testament. The second thing that distinguishes Isaac is that he redug the wells of his father Abraham. Because you always have enemies when you're digging wells and you're forging out. People want to throw stones at you or at what you've built. So his job was to reclaim what his father had started and to improve it. I think that was my task here at this church. Not to found a new church. Al Muro did that. Not to preach the gospel. He did that. Some of you know that Al stood out here on this corner with a stop sign before there was a light there because there were so many accidents. And he would stand out there in his robe with a stop sign to have people stop. Very dangerous to put your life on the line like that, but that's what Al did. Until we got a stoplight out there. So Isaac's task was to rebuild what his father started, to carry on the ministry. And then Isaac got married. He and Rebekah had two sons, twins as a matter of fact, Esau and Jacob. Esau, you know why he was named Esau? Because he was ruddy and hairy, and that means ruddy and hairy. Esau, he was a man of the earth. And then there was Jacob. Jacob's name means heel holder. He was holding on to his twin brother's heel when he came out of the womb. And it also can mean trickster or tripper. Fits his name, fits his personality. Because Jacob was a conniver. He tried to fool his father into believing that he was his other son. He tried to fool his uncle. Jacob had a kind of a mean streak in him. But he was God's man. And one day, God confronted Jacob by the river Jabbok. And there was a wrestling match. And Jacob's hip was put out of joint. And he walked with a limp for the rest of his life. But he had a name change. His name was changed from Jacob to Israel. Whenever you see a word that ends in E-L, that means of God. Bethel, house of God. And Beth always means house of. Beth, house of whatever. Bethlehem, house of bread. Bethphage, house of figs. Bethany. Whenever you see the word Beth, it means house of. Whenever you see the word El, E-L, it means God. I don't know how we got on that, but Jacob now becomes Israel. And Israel marries several women, has 12 sons, one of whom is Joseph. You remember the story of Joseph. Went from the pit to the palace, sold into slavery, became the Pharaoh's right-hand man, and saved Egypt from starving, and Israel in the process. Well, I like all of them. And Joseph, to me, is the most Christ-like figure in the Old Testament. You read the story and you'll find that he never sinned. You say, well, didn't he brag about seeing dreams and having visions? They were true, though. He wasn't lying. He wasn't boasting. He was just telling the way it was. He was a dreamer, but he never sinned. And he was the rescuer of his people from Egypt. Well, but Joseph makes the list, but he's not my favorite. And by the way, it's not just men who are to be noted. No, I'm discounting Rahab and Bathsheba. There are only two women whose names have books named after them. You know who they are? Ruth and Esther. Esther. Beautiful story. If you haven't read the book of Esther recently, read it again, because she really saved her people also. She won the favor of the king because of her beauty, but she saved her people by the content of her heart. She was a magnificent woman and took her life in her own hands when she approached the king without an invitation. In those days, that was not done. And then there was Ruth. Now, Ruth is not my favorite woman in the Bible, although a woman who's associated with Ruth is. Her name was Naomi. Do you know the story? Have you read that recently? It's a beautiful story. Who was Naomi's husband? Do you know? You know his name? How quickly we forget. Look it up. It's in the book. Naomi and her husband were living in Bethlehem, of all places, and a famine hit the land. And her husband, being a man of action, decided, I'm going to move my family to somewhere it's more prosperous. We're going to go to Moab, just across the way, just a little bit across the desert, but I hear they have prosperous crops and we can make a living there. So he takes his wife and his two sons, by the way, their names are Mahlon and Chilion, and they move to Moab. I don't think he asked Naomi what she thought about that. He's the man of the house. I make the decisions. I'm the one who's the breadwinner. We're going to Moab. Are you going to go? Okay. So Naomi goes with her husband and their two sons to Moab. Now, while they're there, wouldn't you know what happens? These two guys fall in love with local women, Oprah and Naomi, Oprah and Ruth. And then Naomi's husband dies. Now she's a widow. Then her two sons die. Now she's a widow with two foreign daughters-in-law in a strange land with no way to make a living. What's she going to do? I've got to go back home, she said, to the only land I know. I've got to go back to Judah, to Bethlehem. So she says to her two daughters-in-law, girls, I don't have any more sons for you to marry, and you're going to have to stay here. Find husbands in your own land. So Oprah, after she cries, does leave her mother-in-law, but Ruth doesn't. You know what she says? God forbid that I should ever leave you. For whithersoever thou goest, I will go. Whatever you do, I will do. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. I submit to you that there was something about Naomi. There was something about this woman whose leadership, whose heart won her daughter-in-law over. And she took her foreign daughter back to the land of her birth. Naomi was a woman after God's own heart. Naomi had a plan. When she got back, she looked around, and she remembered that she had some kinsmen there. And there was this guy who had a very prosperous field. Obviously, good times had returned to Bethlehem while they were gone. And so she sees a man whose name is Boaz, and she says to Ruth, now I'm going to coach you, my daughter, in how to get a husband. You go and glean in his field. Don't say anything, just be there. Be present. Let him notice you. And so Boaz did notice her. And then later, she said, now, you need to let him know that you are attracted to him. And she told her how to do that. Well, it must have worked, because Boaz married Ruth, and they had a child whose name was, what was his name? Obed. And then he got married and had a child whose name was Jesse, and he got married and had a child whose name was David. So here now you have Naomi, who's responsible for bringing this Moabite woman into the line of heritage that produces Jesus the Christ. Naomi was a woman after God's own heart. She was a leader. And too often we overlook the qualities that women bring to leadership. Well, I'd have to say that of the women in the Bible, Naomi is my favorite. But I can't stop there. We haven't even gotten to the New Testament. And we have only another 2 hours to go. I looked at all those characters in the New Testament, and I finally decided that my favorite Bible personality is Andrew. And you say, who is Andrew? And that's what other people said. Who's Andrew? He's always listed as Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. As if you wouldn't know Andrew apart from his big brother, Peter. Andrew is always listed among the disciples, but never first. Never first. And yet he was the first one called. In fact, in Greek he's called protokletos, which means the first one called. He's the patron saint of 3 different countries: Greece, Scotland, and Russia. That's another story. But you wouldn't know anything about Andrew, really, except he was one of the disciples, unless you turn to the Gospel of John. That's where he takes on flesh and blood. That's where he gets personal. That's where it gets real. And that's where I want to take you now. I'm going to read just a few verses from the first chapter of John to show you how Andrew comes into the picture. This is a story of John the Baptist, who's been preaching and baptizing. And there have been 2 men, at least 2 men, who've been following John. And then Jesus walked by. And John said, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Now, one of the 2 who heard John speak followed him. His name was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. Now, we haven't even been introduced to Simon Peter yet. So he's already known as Simon Peter's brother. He first found his brother, Simon, and said to him, we have found the Messiah, which means the Christ. He brought him to Jesus. And Jesus looked at him and said, so you are Simon, son of John. I'm going to make you Peter. From now on, you're Peter. And he changed his name also right there. Simon, son of John, he would be Johnson. And his name has been changed to Peter, which means rock, so he's Rock Johnson. That's who Peter is, Rock Johnson. He is a rock star. I'm sure that Peter was the biggest of the tribe. He was the strongest, the fastest, had the most girlfriends, caught the most fish, dragged the heaviest net ashore. In fact, we learn later that he does that very thing when we get to the 20th chapter of John. But here's Andrew. Now, Andrew has an opportunity to get ahead of his big brother. But what does he do? No, I've got to have my brother find Jesus. And so he takes Peter, his big brother, to Jesus and says, I want you to meet the man who's going to change our lives. And Jesus said, you're going to be my right-hand man. Why wasn't Andrew his right-hand man? He was the first one called. You know, it's tough to play second fiddle. It's tough not to be the star. I wonder sometimes when I go to concerts and I see the first violinist introduced and all the bows, what about the second violin and the third violin? They're all part of the orchestra. But we single out one person as the director or the conductor or the pastor or the first violinist. But if it were not for those people in the orchestra, in the congregation, in the group, wouldn't get anywhere. There's teamwork involved. So Andrew introduces his big brother to Jesus, and Andrew becomes the number one star of the whole group. Whenever Jesus calls of his 12, 3 to him to do some special counseling, it's always Peter, James, and John, you know? Peter, James, and John. Where's Andrew? He's in the group. Well, the second time we meet Andrew is in the 6th chapter of John. And now this is at the Feast of Passover. No, I'm sorry. It's at the feeding of the 5,000. By the way, this is the only miracle other than the resurrection that's mentioned in all 4 Gospels. So it must have made a great impression on these disciples to have the feeding of the 5,000. How did that happen? Well, I'm in the 6th chapter of John, and Jesus has all the people sit down. I could preach a whole sermon on this, but I won't. I know you're glad. Jesus has all the people sit down. And what are they going to do? They're all hungry. But Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, it says, was out in the crowd, pressing the flesh, meeting people. Hi, how are you? My name's Andrew. Yeah, I'm related to that big guy up there. Yeah, what? I'd like to meet you. And in the conversation, he discovers this kid, this boy who's been sent off for the day by his mother with a lunch. He has some sardines, that's what these smoked fish were, and little barley loaves. Now, I know it wasn't this way, but I picture it this way, that he had it wrapped up in a paper bag and in his back pocket and been sitting on it all day. But what would that be among so many? But anyway, Andrew brought the boy to Jesus because Jesus would know what to do. It's very little, but who knows? In the hands of Jesus, anything is possible. That's what Andrew had discovered. So Andrew, in his optimism, brings this boy to Jesus. And Jesus knows exactly what to do. He takes what the boy has offered him and blesses it and thanks God for it and has the disciples give it out among all the people. Can you imagine the faith it took for those guys to take what Jesus had blessed to distribute to 5,000 people? But they did it. And they have 12 baskets full left over. How is that possible? By Andrew who brought this boy optimistically to Jesus. Now, the third time we find Andrew is in the 12th chapter of John. This is at the Feast of the Passover, and people are all coming from all over the world who are Jews to come to the Feast of the Passover. But now listen to this. Now, among those who went up to worship at the feast were some Greeks. So they came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and said to him, "Sir, we wish to see Jesus." And Philip went and told Andrew, and Andrew brought them to Jesus. Now you may wonder why they went to Philip. Of all the apostolic band, Philip is the only one with a Greek name. So they felt comfortable by going to someone who spoke their language, who had their kind of name. And so they go to Philip. By the way, this is from another sermon. Judas, you may wonder what Judas was doing in that group. Judas was from Iscariot. He was the only southerner in the group. The other 11 were all from Galilee. They were fishermen. What was Judas doing there? I'm sure he liked fried chicken, cornbread, black-eyed peas. He probably spoke with a drawl, you know what I mean? And kind of slurred his words from time to time. But he was in charge of the treasury, you know. What was Judas doing there? Jesus called him. That's what he was doing there. He was different, but he was a part of the group. Jesus had hope for him, as he has hope for each of us, accents or not, educated or not. But the Greeks go to Philip. Philip doesn't know what to do, so he goes to Andrew. Andrew knows what to do. Anytime anybody wants to see Jesus, take him. Take him. And so Andrew takes the Greeks to Jesus. Now notice this. Andrew, when he brought Jesus, when he brought his brother, Peter, became the first home missionary. When he brought the boy, he became the first child evangelist. When he brought the Greeks, he became the first foreign missionary. You see why Andrew is my favorite disciple and character of the whole Bible? Because he's always bringing somebody to Jesus. You're going to be having an evangelism conference pretty soon to train you how to be an evangelist. Not everyone is called to be an evangelist. Pastor Steve has told you that. But everyone is called to be a witness. And a witness is sworn to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. We are all called to be witnesses to the love and grace of God. But sometimes we need an Andrew to propel us along. I've had an Andrew in my life. Some of you have heard me tell this story before, so you'll hear it again. This was in 1953. I was a young recruit in the Air Force. This was during the Korean War. I just finished basic training. This was in April, the Sunday after Easter, in April of 1953. I was sent to Lowry Air Force Base in Denver, Colorado. I got there on a Friday night, and it was snowing in April in Denver. Well, if you've been to Denver, some of you have, I know. You know it can get cold and snowy in April, and it was. So on Saturday, I walked through the snow to go to the PX to find out, to get some essentials and try to get warm, because the barracks was not very warm. And I only had my khakis on. You know, from Texas, you just wear khakis. Well, I asked where there's a church on the base. No one knew where there was a church on the base. I said, where is there a church I can go to? They said, well, you can take the bus at the base gate and go into downtown Denver and find a church there. And that's what I decided to do. So early Sunday morning, I got up. I got dressed as many clothes that I could put on, walked through the snow, stood at the main gate for about 5 minutes until the bus from downtown Denver came out. I got on the bus and went right to the place where there was a heater under the seat. I sat down there. I was the only person on the bus. No one else got on the bus. So the bus driver, after about 5 minutes, left, and we started down Colfax Avenue into downtown Denver, and suddenly I heard steps in the aisle beside me. No one had gotten on this bus. No one else was on this bus besides the driver and me. And this guy stopped by my seat, and he looked down at me and said, hey, are you going to church today? I said, yes, I'm going to church. He said, why don't you go with me? I said, I'm going to go to a Baptist church. I was going to go down, look at the telephone directory and find a Baptist church and go to it. He said, I go to a Baptist church. I said, okay. So he pulled the buzzer. We got off, walked 2 blocks up through the snow. We had to walk on the street because the sidewalks hadn't been cleared yet. And at the back door of this little church on the corner, City Park Baptist Church, a guy was holding the door open. He had opened the door just to let people in and close it to keep the cold out. So he opened the door as we were approaching. We went in to the class that this fellow taught. And it was a young adults class, I guess college age. And we were the only 2 service people there. About 12, 14 of us were in that room. So we had the class, and then the teacher said, now because it's snowing and the streets haven't been cleaned off, the sidewalks haven't been shoveled, let's go through the church, in the kitchen, and we'll go into the sanctuary from the back door. So we started down the hallway, and I turned to say something to this guy who brought me. And he was going out the door. And I said, do any of you know his name? They said, who? I said, the guy who brought me. Who brought you? I said, the guy that I was riding in the bus with, and we came in here, and he knew his way around. No one had seen him. No one knew his name, and I'd never seen him again. But it was at that church that I met Beverly. It was that church that the pastor later was to call me into his office and say, you know, Bill, I believe you should go into ministry, but I'm getting a divorce, and this church would never have a divorced pastor, so I'm going to go to the American Cancer Society. That was in 1953. In 1968, that pastor became my associate at the First Baptist Church of Pasadena. The fellow at the door, who was opening the door, was the head of civilian personnel at Lowry Air Force Base. He was the one who called me back from Panama City, Florida, back to Denver to go through special training. So God has his personal people out waiting for you. You're given an invitation, but you have to say yes. You have to say yes. So there's something you can do. You're maybe not going to be writing great hymns or commissioning missionaries, but you can invite somebody to come to church with you. You can tell them what time service is, who the pastor is, and what you're doing here. You can not only invite, you could bring someone with you. Because that's really what we are here for. Every Christian is to live to the praise of God's glory. I'm glad that Andrew was in that apostolic band. I don't think they would have been the same without him. Never listed first, but so critical to their enterprise. Jesus has a place for every one of his disciples, whether it's Judas, Andrew, Philip, whoever. And he has a place for you. You have to find your place. What is it that you can do that God will bless? But how would you know until you try? How would you know? You say, well, I'm just a young girl. I can't do that. Or I'm just a young boy. Or I don't have those gifts. You ask God to reveal to you what he has in store for you and what's possible for you. There are too many women who should be in leadership who are not in leadership because they've been told, well, you're a girl, or you can't do that. You're not strong enough. You're not able enough. Well, whatever goes with that. You're God's child. Nothing is impossible. If God calls you, be obedient. I mentioned that I was in Panama City, Florida. And I had not been called into ministry. I was still in the Air Force. I was on the back pew of the First Baptist Church of Panama City, Florida. This was in April of 1953, so it was a year later. I'd been sent to Tyndall Air Force Base to work on F-86Ds, F-94Cs, air-to-air radar. And so the first Sunday I was there, it wasn't snowing. It was in April, but in Florida. So I took the bus from the base, went downtown, and I sat on the back row, like most of you normally did. Sat on the back row. And there was a visiting evangelist that day. And he said, God is calling someone here to full-time Christian service. Have you ever heard that term? Full-time Christian service, as if we were part-time Christians. So they sang, Just As I Am, 11 times. I was holding on to the back of that. I wasn't going to go down that aisle because I knew that if I did, it would change my life. And I was rather happy with the life I had. I had met Beverly. We were going to be married, and so I wasn't going to change anything. But this guy, after the invitation, he stood in front of the pulpit down here. And we were all standing. And I was on the back row, and so I'd hide behind the guy in front of me. And he would lean this way. You ever done that? And then he'd lean this way. He kept looking at me the whole time. I thought, as long as I can get through this hymn. After 11 times, he said, I know there's someone else here. We're going to sing it one more time. Well, fortunately, at that time, I got out without making a commitment. I ran for the bus stop, and the bus was just leaving. So I had to stand there while everyone else came out, and this visiting pastor and the local pastor came by in the car, and this guy turned and looked at me the whole way. Well, the next Sunday, I knew I'd be safe. He was a visiting evangelist. He would not be back. So the pastor preached an innocuous sermon. I mean, I shouldn't say innocuous, but it was innocuous. And the invitation was given, and I again felt the compunction to go down the aisle. But I held on to my favorite spot. And that's when God spoke to me. And these are the words. The longer you hold out, the less the call will be. So I turned loose and I went down the aisle. I said to the pastor, I don't know why I'm here. His name was Julius Avery. They called him the Big Bear. This guy was large, larger than Wade Locker. And dominant put together. This guy was large. He put his arm around me. He says, well, the Lord knows, and you're at home now, son. Southern Baptist, And so that church licensed me to preach. It was there that I found other Andrews, and I was able to encourage other people because of God's faithfulness. Whenever you're called, be obedient. That's all you have to do, is just be obedient. You're not asked to go to Africa or Asia, maybe to the Gospel Rescue Mission, or maybe to the soup kitchen, or maybe to the school down the street that needs some special help. But wherever God's calling you, be obedient and you will be blessed. That's his promise. He will use a boy with some sardines and rolls to feed 5,000 people. What could he do with you? Think about it. The power of the personal. We're called to love people and use things. Who are you in love with? Pray with me. Lord, I ask your blessing upon this congregation and its pastor and all its leaders, its teachers, for the potential that's here and the growth that's going to take place. I thank you for the past. Thank you for good memories. And I thank you also for the future, for what you have in store. And upon each person here, I ask your blessing. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, I have a belief that whenever the truth is preached and Jesus Christ is elevated, people should be able to respond. So I'm going to give you the opportunity. If you know that God has something in store for you, or if you've never made that surrender of your life to Christ, do so right now and do it publicly. You don't have anything to be ashamed of. He won't be ashamed of you. No matter what you've done, where you've been, what foibles and failures you've had, what scars are on your body. You say, well, see, I'm not clean. I'm a sinner. You know, I expect when I go to the hospital to find sick people. I expect when I come to church to find sinners. That's where we gather. Foibles, failures, scars, and all. So if God has something in mind for you, be obedient and be blessed. We're going to sing a hymn of invitation. What's it going to be? Open the eyes of my heart, Lord. And if you're here and you have a decision to make about your relationship with God, come forward and take my hand, and Pastor Steve and I will give you our blessing. Let's stand.